Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordi.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys
don't know a damn thing about it.
So today's case is one that you may have already heard of before. It's a pretty infamous case and probably one of the most terrifying and bizarre cold cases in American history that has haunted authorities and the public at large for over half a century by this point. Today we're going to be talking about the very tragic and downright terrifying murder of Betsy Aardsma. Now right away the name itself may not jump out to any of you, but just to give you a brief overview of the case, a few details may start to jump out at you. So Betsy Aardsma was a 22-year-old graduate student at Penn State University, yes, that Penn State, who in November of 1969 was studying in the university library, an area in the basement known as the Stacks, when she was swiftly killed by an assailant who disappeared into the night. Despite her murder taking place in a very public space, no one has ever been arrested in connection with her murder, and her case remains cold. But even with no arrests, several strong suspects have emerged over the years that could answer the question, who killed Betsy Aardsma? So I don't really have much more to add, so let's just jump right into it. But this is one of the cases that probably scares me the most, because when we do cover the majority of true crime cases, it's usually in isolated locations or some other place, but this is a murder that took place in the Penn State University library with dozens and dozens of potential witnesses. Like, it's a very populous area of the campus. So the fact that such a brutal murder occurred there and was never solved is horrifying to think about.
Yeah, and it's one of those places where you think you're safe. Like, you do not assume that the library would be a dangerous place.
But unfortunately, in this case, it very much was. It's the afternoon of November 28, 1969, at Penn State University, located in University Park, Pennsylvania. It was the day after Thanksgiving, so the campus was still pretty empty by this point, with many students having not yet returned from holiday break. Just after 4:30 p.m., 22-year-old graduate student Betsy Aardsma made her way across campus to the Patty Library in order to look up sources and research for an English paper she had been working on. The stop at the library was a spur-of-the-moment detour, as Betsy had made plans to meet up with friends immediately after in order to go catch a movie from there. Now, as she entered the library, she searched up references before finding the one that told her which books she needed for her paper. They were located down a flight of stairs in the basement floor of the library, an area known as the Stacks, due to the tight rows and stacks of books that line the area from wall to wall. Just going off a description of the Stacks, it does sound straight out of a horror movie. The area is in a basement. It is dimly lit throughout most of the area, especially towards the back of the room. And the rows of books are so tight together that only one person can enter or exit at a time, just really emphasizing a sense of claustrophobia.
And fire danger.
And fire danger. This is the 60s still, so, fire codes weren't up to date. But even if that sounds creepy, this is still a public library on a very popular campus, so Betsy didn't find herself alone down there. At least 3 other identified people were also browsing the stacks at this time, including 2 students named Marilee Erdely and Zhao Yufanda, who, like Betsy, were getting books for upcoming term papers. The other individual was a 55-year-old man named Richard Allen, who was killing time until his son, who was a student at the university, was free. Now, Marilee and Betsy actually knew each other as they shared several classes, and the two exchanged hellos as they passed each other in the stacks. Marilee, Zhao, and Richard were all browsing aisles located towards the front of the basement towards the exit as Betsy made her way towards the dimly lit back area. The final sighting of Betsy Aardsma when she was alive would occur at 4:45 p.m. as an assistant supervisor at the library named Dean Brungart was passing through and noticed her browsing books near the back. Betsy immediately stood out to him due to her wearing a bright all-red dress, and that does come into play later. Dean would also mention that a few rows down from Betsy, he spotted two young men huddled at the end of one row whispering to each other. 10 minutes after this, Richard Allen would be standing in one of the middle rows of the stacks using a photocopier when he heard a man and a woman begin speaking to each other. Although they were too quiet for him to make anything out they were saying, he would later state that the conversation did not sound heated or intense in any way. Just after 4:55 p.m., Richard, Marilee, and Zhao would all hear what sounded like a fist hitting someone's chest, followed by a soft gasp. After a brief second of silence, a loud thud came from one of the back rows in the stacks, followed by the sound of books and, quote, something metallic hitting the ground. Moments later, a young man, estimated to be around 25 years old, emerged from one of the rows of books and began walking full speed towards the exit where Marilee and Zhao were standing. He was described as wearing a sports jacket over a white shirt with khaki pants, which Marilee noted seemed a bit more properly dressed than the average Penn State student. The young man was clean-shaven and stood a little over 6 feet tall with brown hair and glasses, and as he walked towards the exit, that's when he spotted Marilee and Zhao. Now, although he did not come to a complete stop, the strange man did slow down and addressed the two, telling them, quote, someone had better help that girl, while pointing towards the back of the stacks where the noise came from. The man continued moving towards the exit when he encountered Richard Allen. Instead of speaking to him, the stranger made a quick U-turn and went back towards the back of the stacks where another stairwell led to an exit. So while Marilee went to go see what the noise was, Zhao followed the strange man, later stating that English was not his first language, so he thought the man said, we have to help this girl, and he thought the man was leading him to the girl, which is why he was following him. Zhao followed the man up the stairs and out of the library, but found the man was too fast and he quickly lost track of him. Richard and Zhao didn't believe anything was wrong and left the library shortly after this encounter, never realizing that they had been witnesses to a murder. Meanwhile, Marilee was the one who made her way to row 51, where she spotted the body of a young woman lying on the floor about halfway down the aisle. It was Betsy. She laid halfway on her side, pushed up against a bookshelf. Books were scattered around her and on top of her as she laid in a puddle of her own urine. Her eyes were closed, and she looked as if she was sleeping. No blood or visible injuries was present on her body, so at first Marilee thought Betsy may have just had a seizure or passed out or hit her head or something. So she screamed for help, and the librarians on the floor above quickly rushed down to see what happened before calling an ambulance. Now, when paramedics arrived, they found Betsy only had a small splotch of blood on her chest, which they assumed was from her fall or biting her tongue when she had a seizure, which by this point is definitely what they assumed happened. During this time, she still had a pulse and was quickly rushed to the hospital. Upon arriving, Betsy's condition began to deteriorate quickly as she began to flatline, and doctors started to perform CPR. They were baffled due to believing this was a simple seizure and what honestly could possibly be causing this, but that's when one of the nurses screamed at them to stop as she noticed blood beginning to seep through Betsy's shirt. Removing her dress and the turtleneck she had on underneath it, doctors were shocked and horrified to discover that Betsy had actually been stabbed. A single stab wound directly over her heart was seeping blood. But sadly, by the time they noticed the wound and began life-saving surgery, it was already too late, and Betsy Aardsma was pronounced dead at 5:50 p.m. As I said, it was hard. There was only a single stab wound, but also she was wearing a bright red dress, and it helped conceal any little blood that there was. And so this did cause a large gap between the time that they found her almost immediately, but assuming it was a simple seizure, they weren't in any sort of rush. They just thought she passed out. So
Yeah, I don't think attempting CPR on a stab wound to the chest is a good thing either.
Not that either. And so by the time they realized that, it was, I'm not going to say it was the doctor's fault. It was like a very unfortunate set of circumstances here. So her autopsy would begin that same night at 11 p.m. by Dr. Thomas Magani, and he discovered that Betsy suffered from a single stab wound that had penetrated her breastplate and actually pierced her pulmonary artery, causing her to bleed out almost instantly. The reason no blood was present at the scene, or really anywhere on Betsy, save for a small spot, was due to the fact the knife wound was incredibly clean and precise. To the naked eye, it was honestly barely visible and was just a tiny little slit in her chest. And due to the fact Betsy was wearing a bright red dress, what blood was present blended in with her clothing. She had no defensive wounds nor any foreign DNA on her body or under her fingernails, and due to how precise the stab wound was and that it was aimed directly at her heart, the doctor was 100% certain that her killer knew what he was doing and his intent was to murder Betsy. Betsy's autopsy was completed at 4 a.m. on November 29th, and immediately following this, a criminal investigation was launched with 35 officers being dispatched to Penn State campus to look for any evidence or witnesses. Now, sadly, the investigation into Betsy's murder was difficult from the start. Due to the fact that her murder was initially thought to have been a seizure, the librarians quickly cleaned up the crime scene after Betsy was rushed to the hospital, mopping up the floor and placing the books on the shelf, possibly destroying any DNA. Again, one of those series of unfortunate circumstances. They had no idea to know this was a murder. It did seem just like a simple seizure, and so it's just luck was on the killer's side in this case, sadly. Still, troopers taped off the entire library and began to comb over the basement stacks for any clues. No murder weapon was found, nor any other physical evidence. Dozens of books that had fallen near where she was murdered were bagged and taken in as evidence. The only notable thing that stuck out to investigators was a single smudge of blood found on the wall of the stairs leading out of the basement. The blood matched Betsy's blood type, and it's theorized that her killer must have gotten at least some of her blood on him as he fled the crime scene. By dawn the next morning, news of what had happened began to spread across campus as everyone awoke to the news that a student at Penn State had been murdered in the library by a still unknown and uncaught killer. As panic spread and fear washed over the students, everyone couldn't help but wonder who would kill a 22-year-old girl who, by all accounts, was a beloved and straight-laced student. So, before we get into that a little bit more, let's tell you a little bit about Betsy Aardsma and her life leading up to her untimely demise. So, like I said, this is a terrifying case to think about. Just browsing the books, and then you get stabbed through the heart. So Elizabeth Ruth Betsy Aardsma was born on July 11th, 1947, to Esther and Richard Aardsma in Holland, Michigan, and was the second of 4 children by the couple. Little is known about Betsy's early years, but we know she was described as being an incredibly happy child throughout her childhood. She developed an extreme love for art and poetry, and according to her mother, an extreme compassion for anyone that was less fortunate than herself. She loved to help the underprivileged. Betsy was also described as having fairly, quote, liberal ideas, especially for the time period, as she was said to be fairly vocal about her support and compassion towards the civil rights movement and even homosexuals, both of whom, 1969, were still very much fighting for their rights. She excelled in school and graduated at one of the top of her class at Holland High School in 1965, and soon after she enrolled at Hope's College with dreams of becoming a doctor one day. So she was an incredibly bright young woman. One report stated that Betsy was, quote, so bright, if she had lived, she could have been a doctor's wife. Because remember, this is the 1960s. But no, baby, she was going to be the doctor. However, by the end of her freshman year at Hope College, Betsy seemed to change her mind about becoming a doctor and instead started shifting her focus towards doing more community work and giving back to those less fortunate, such as volunteering to help Black youths in school. And during her junior year, Betsy met and fell in love with a boy named David Wright, and the two were described as being incredibly smitten with one another and always spent their free time together. But Betsy never allowed him to be alone with her in her dorm room, as she didn't want him to think that she was, quote, that kind of girl. Which, good, you ain't some girl that just gives it up, you gotta work for it. Now, by 1969, Betsy was in her final year of school and making plans for what she wanted to do after. Her original plan was to go on to graduate school, but that was kind of up in the air, and now she was contemplating becoming a missionary in Africa. Like I said, she really was passionate about helping others. She finally made her decision after discussing it with her boyfriend, because he told her bluntly that he probably would not wait for her if she went overseas.
I mean, if you put it out there in the beginning, you can't be mad, right?
I mean, that's fair. At least he was honest.
I mean, that's better than him cheating on her the entire time and then she come back to nothing.
That is true. I will say, though, David still sounds like a real piece of work, and we'll find out that towards the end of the episode. I will say you right now, he was never a suspect. He is not the one that murdered Betsy. They did seem to have a pretty solid relationship, but in my personal opinion, Betsy seemed more committed, and you'll find out here in a minute. David was making plans to go to Penn State for graduate school, and Betsy decided to join him there, and in October of 1969, the two enlisted as students at Penn State University. While David was also planning to become a doctor, Betsy decided that she may like to pursue a career as an educator for small children. During her very short time at Penn State, Betsy wasted no time getting involved with activism and joined in on several large-scale protests on campus surrounding civil rights and opposition to the Vietnam War. By November, her and David were talking about getting engaged at Christmas and making plans to marry following their graduation. On Thanksgiving, Betsy spent it with David and his family before he dropped her off at the bus station to catch a ride back to Penn State, as she wanted to spend the next few days studying for their upcoming exams, as she felt like she was falling behind in English and it was really starting to stress her out. David dropped her off, kissed her goodbye, and never saw her again. Betsy had been a student at Penn State for just 8 weeks at the time of her murder, and with that, we are back to where we started, November 28th, 1989. So that's what's even more terrifying.
Not 1989.
1969. Typo, sorry. So that day, Betsy decided to sleep in until around noon. She had gone back to campus late the previous night from the bus station. The first thing she did upon waking up was write a letter to David, and this is something she had done every single day for the last year. She got dressed, mailed the letter, and then decided to tackle writing her English paper. She got lunch with a friend and her roommate named Sharon Brandt before the two decided to make plans to go see a movie later that evening. They parted ways before Betsy made her way to the office of Professor Nicholas Jakowski. I think I pronounced that right. Her English professor, who had asked to speak to her earlier in that day. The professor asked Betsy if she still had a book in her possession that she used as a source for her English paper, as he wanted to see it for his evaluation of her work. She told him that she had already returned it to the Patty Library, but could retrieve it and bring it to him as she was already planning to make a stop there anyways. With that, Betsy left his office and made her way towards the library just after 4 p.m., and from there, less than an hour later, she would be murdered. Betsy stopped and conversed with 2 friends of hers from class named Linda Marsa and Robert Steinberg before heading inside, and other than those 4 interactions with Sharon, her professor, and the 2 friends outside the library entrance, Betsy is not known to have any other interactions, nor is she known to have told anyone of her plans to visit the library that evening, outside of those 4 people, all 4 of whom were quickly cleared as suspects as none were even close to the library when the murder occurred. Which begs the question, was Betsy being stalked or was this a random act of violence? None of the witnesses who saw Betsy that day reported any signs of someone following her, and all of them stated that she seemed to be in pretty high spirits, although she did seem stressed out due to having to write her English paper. One interesting piece of info investigators would find out later was that Betsy had casually mentioned that she thought she had a stalker a few weeks before her murder, although she refused to elaborate and honestly didn't seem that concerned about it. Those who knew Betsy stated that she was a pretty cautious and paranoid person to begin with, so even stating that one of the deciding factors of her switching colleges was due to the fact that she had a fear of a serial killer stalking and murdering young female co-eds around Michigan college campuses, which that is true. Like, she didn't just make that up. There was a serial killer from 1967 to 1969 named John Norman Collins who murdered at least 7 college girls in and around where Betsy was originally going to college. So it sent a wave of panic across the whole state, as a lot of female college students were like, I think I'm going to transfer out of state. So despite several people stating Betsy mentioned a stalker, nothing ever actually came of it, and officials would later come out and state that no evidence existed that this was true. But if she didn't have a stalker, then what happened? Betsy was not expected to be on Penn State campus that day, and her return was a last-minute idea in order to study, so it's not like someone had her schedule ahead of time. On top of that, there was no signs of sexual trauma or any sort of assault like that, so that also didn't seem plausible. Also, the fact that she was murdered in such a populous and open area with other witnesses in the same room just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense someone would choose this location to murder her if they had planned it out in advance. Well, as police comb over the area, a few possibilities emerge, as do a few interesting suspects in the weeks following her death. So right off the bat, at the initial crime scene, investigators find only a single smudge of blood in a stairwell leading out of the basement stacks. Other than that, no blood is found at the scene of the crime. But just in case, investigators took a blacklight and began to sweep over the stacks one by one in search of any potential blood that may have been wiped up by the librarians when they were cleaning the scene. They scanned every inch of the basement, and although no blood was found, what was found led to the initial and still popular theory that it was possible Betsy had accidentally stumbled upon, quote, a homosexual encounter occurring in the stacks, and that she was murdered in order to keep her from telling anyone what she saw. Now, of course, this may seem a little bit of a stretch at first, and of course it just plays into these stereotypes that were so prominent during this time, which is that homosexuals are sex perverts, deviants, and even murderers. But upon further investigation, this theory actually had some credit behind it, because although blood wasn't found when the room was searched with a blacklight, the room lit up with splatters and spots
Of semen.
of lots and lots of semen, and I don't think I can stress to y'all how much semen was found. Semen was found on the floor, on the walls, on the shelves, on the ceiling, and even inside and on multiple books in the basement. Investigators would later state that every inch of the area was covered in semen.
I mean, I'm picturing it in my head and it's just blowing my mind, you know. I mean, it's like going into a Motel 6 or something with a black light, I guess.
And that's the worst. So I didn't know this until reading it. So it's like semen lights up yellow under a black light. And so they were taking it to it, and they're like, I don't see blood anywhere, but it's lighting up yellow everywhere, which means there is semen everywhere. So digging deeper into this, they found a desk which was also covered in semen in one isolated corner of the basement. This desk had over a dozen pornographic magazines hidden inside of it. These magazines consisted of heterosexual porn, but also homosexual porn. The homosexual magazines were actually from New Zealand, where it had recently been legalized. So the homosexual magazines were so rare that one single magazine cost $10, or the 2024 equivalent of $182 for a single magazine. Which, I mean, fair, it's extremely rare. That's not legal in America, so you gotta import. Meaning no one was just gonna forget or casually leave these behind unless they left in a hurry. The chair at the desk was left pushed back like someone had been sitting in it, and a can of soda set on top of the desk that still had some fizz to it, meaning it had recently been opened. Several of the magazines were also dated as being from November 1969. But now that's not all. Pretty soon as investigators combed through all the books in the library, they began making some discoveries. Gay pornographic magazines that had been hidden within the pages of multiple books, all through the library, including over a dozen being found in the exact same aisle where Betsy had been murdered. Looking back at police records, investigators also discovered that in just the last several months, at least 4 men had been arrested from the library after being caught masturbating in the basement. This led police to theorize that the area was actually a secret and very popular cruising spot for closeted gay men to meet and hook up. Now, although it was still a public library and was popular with students, the basement had many dark and dimly lit corners to hide or be alone and not get caught. And this is the 1960s, so it's not like Grindr was a thing or you could really take them home.
Now, hold on. This is a public library or this is a library in Penn State?
So this is a library on Penn State University, but from what I've read, it sounds like anybody can check into it. I don't know how it worked back in the 60s, but from all, like, the older man, the Richard Allen, he was there. He wasn't a student. His son was, but he was just killing time in the library. So it sounds like in the 60s it was a lot more laxed in terms of who could come and go from the library. So investigators theorized it's possible Betsy may have stumbled upon two men engaged in homosexual sex, as they call it, or maybe even a single man whom she caught masturbating to gay porn, and not wanting her to tell anyone or out them, they panicked and quickly killed her to keep her quiet before fleeing.
Which means they had a knife on them to begin with. A very sharp knife.
It does. So, again, it's one of those theories. It doesn't explain everything. It might explain some things. Like, one of the things people think it explains is why the killer, the strange man, why he would draw attention to Betsy when he was leaving. Because that strange man, as he was leaving, he actually told two people, like, you need to go help that girl. And so they were like, if it wasn't a planned murder, maybe he panicked, stabbed her, and then freaked out. Was like, oh my God, what'd I do? Someone go help her. I'm going to run. But at the same time, why would he have a knife on him? So it's one of those things, could potentially answer some questions, but not all of them.
And also, didn't like the coroner say that he thought that they planned to stab her because it was done so well?
They did, and I mentioned it here in a minute. They do theorize they think Betsy knew her killer in some capacity. Because if you remember, she didn't make any sounds either, and they had to get pretty close to stab her. So now, murdering someone in cold blood for catching you with another man seems like an extreme overreaction nowadays, but you do have to look at it from a 1960s lens. Homosexuality was still very illegal at this point, and if you were caught engaged with sex with another man, not only could you be arrested and sent to jail for up to 10 years, you would lose your job, be expelled from school, and shunned by your friends and family. So for a lot of people, your life would essentially be over. One thing investigators are pretty confident about, though, is they believe Betsy must have known her killer in some capacity. Like if they weren't friends, she knew who they were. Like they didn't have to be like best friends, but she's like, maybe it was someone she went to class with, maybe it was a professor. It could have been she knew who they were. And this is due to the fact that they were able to get literally almost chest to chest with her without her making any sort of scream or honestly any noise really. She had no defensive wounds and didn't try to run, so it seems she didn't fear for her life at all. Now, although the gay theory seemed plausible now, and partial fingerprints were able to be pulled from several of the magazines and the soda can, none were able to be used to check for suspects. So as the investigation continued, fewer and fewer viable leads started emerging, and pretty soon nasty rumors began to spread around campus because remember, kids, including college kids, can be shitheads, about why Betsy was murdered. The rumors ranged from she was having an affair, to she stumbled upon a drug deal gone wrong, to she herself was a drug dealer. Now, no evidence exists that any of these are true whatsoever, and if anything, they just serve no purpose other than to try and tarnish the reputation of a dead girl. Sadly, the case went cold almost immediately following the initial investigation, and Betsy's case started to quickly fade from the front page papers as a more infamous crime case had just been solved and sent shockwaves across the country. Now do you know what infamous crime case got solved in 1969? Testing your knowledge here.
I do not.
Just a week after Betsy's murder, officials announced that they had
Was Ted Bundy?
No. So officials announced that they had arrested members of the Manson family in connection with the Tate LaBianca murders in California. The case dominated the front page of every newspaper across the country for months afterwards, pushing any other cases, including Betsy's, off the front page and into obscurity. Now, you may be wondering about those 3 witnesses I mentioned who were in the library too when Betsy was murdered. Well, all 3 were tracked down and told of what happened, and using info provided from all 3, police had a composite sketch made of the man they saw walking away from the area where Betsy was murdered. So this is great. They got a pretty good sketch out of this, but police chose not to release it to the public for over a year. Why? They never gave an answer.
Poor Betsy. She didn't have a good police experience, a good medical experience, and not a good library experience.
No, like I said, this is one of those cases where it just seems like all of the luck was on the killer's side. like everything, down to even the composite sketch made of him was not released for over a year for whatever reason. Since then, no one has ever been arrested in connection with the murder of Betsy Aardsma, and no real physical evidence was ever found tying anyone to her murder. And sadly, after a while, it started to fade from public memory, and she became known simply as, quote, that girl who was murdered in the basement of the library back in the day. But in the initial years following her murder, several strong suspects did emerge, so let's just go down the list and figure out who and why they could have done it. The first possible suspect that became known to police was at the end of December 1969, when they received a call from a concerned staff member at Penn State who had overheard something concerning. While attending a staff Christmas party a few days prior, a teacher at the school got drunk and was overheard by several people stating, quote, I killed that girl in the library. Investigators quickly followed up on this lead, and that's a pretty strong lead, and went to the home of 40-year-old William Spencer, a sculpting arts teacher at Penn State. When police arrived at his home, the first thing he did was take them into the living room and showed them a massive painting he did of a man and woman having sex that hung above the couch. He smiled and told them, quote, that's a painting I did of me and my mother. So right away, they knew this man did not have all the screws in his head tightened. Williams stated that the staff members had misheard him and that he was actually saying he knew who killed the girl in the library, as he was there and witnessed the whole thing. Williams stated he and Betsy had actually been well acquainted, as she had agreed to pose nude for his sculpting class. William watched as a man in a hat and long overcoat brutally stabbed Betsy before fleeing the scene, and he offered to paint a sketch of the man he saw. But right away, investigators knew his story wasn't adding up, as his description of the killer was vastly different from the other three witnesses, and also, none of them reported seeing William anywhere in the stacks, and this was further confirmed by his wife, who stated the two were out of town the night of the murder. So friends and family of Betsy also found it hard to believe he actually knew her, or that she agreed to pose nude, as Betsy was known to be, quote, a bit prudish. And thus, Williams' claims were dismissed, and he was not considered a viable person of interest.
Well, at first I thought he was a sculptor, and he may have a sculpting tool that he could stab somebody with.
That is possible. But
I was like, maybe, and no, he's just crazy.
He's just a crazy person who also got a very well-respected teaching position at one of the most prestigious schools in America. But again, this is the 1960s, so
It still happens today.
Still happens today. The next suspect came in the early half of 1970 when investigators got a call from Betsy's roommate about a potential lead. The roommate stated that in the weeks leading up to her murder, Betsy had been hanging around a male student named Larry Marr. Larry was a classmate of Betsy, and the two had begun getting to know each other not long before her murder, and even went out for coffee a couple of times, although Betsy's friends assured that it was completely platonic, at least on Betsy's end. So upon looking into Larry, investigators found several interesting clues. First, Larry had admitted to several friends that he was also in the basement stacks the night of the murder, but he had not seen Betsy and was on the opposite side of the room. The second was he was known to carry a large pocket knife around, even though it wasn't permitted on campus. His reasoning was, quote, so he could cut cheese if he ever had to. Whatever that means, I don't know. The final piece of evidence was that in the basement stacks, on a wooden chair at a desk not far from where Betsy was murdered, Larry admitted to using his knife to carve the words, quote, here sits death in the guise of a man. When asked why he did it, he said he didn't know. Now, Larry was brought in for an official interrogation and was even given a polygraph, but with nothing to hold him on, he was quickly let go.
Here sits death in the guise of a man.
Yeah, and he's like, why would you carve that? And he goes, I don't know. So, on top of having no actual physical evidence tying him to the crime, here's the main reason why they kind of let him go. His physical description did not match up at all with the description given by the three witnesses. He was blonde-headed, he was short, he didn't wear glasses, so he also didn't fit the physical description of the guy, so he just seems like a really weird dude.
Well, the thing is, the guy that left the library, he may have not been the killer.
And that's the thing, he may have not been the killer.
He may have just been like, I just saw something I did not want to see, and I want out of here.
Or also, I mentioned that, I don't think I wrote it. It was theorized that if Betsy had caught two men in a homosexual act, that might have been one of the men leaving while the other murdered Betsy, and that other dude was like, someone better go help that girl. That guy's killing her, before leaving. Obviously, he's not going to come forward, because then he'd have to be like, yeah, I was doing gay stuff in the library.
That sounds very reasonable.
So that does sound reasonable. But now, with that, we arrive at our final suspect, and the one that many investigators and historians alike believe is the person who most likely murdered Betsy Aardsma and got away with it. Just a few weeks after Betsy's murder, friends of hers contacted police with another possible suspect that really needed to be looked into. A 25-year-old geology student at Penn State named Richard Charles Haefner. Charles and Betsy were known to be acquainted with one another, at least for a time, but Betsy had called their friendship off after describing Richard as being too intense to her roommate. Richard had even showed up banging on Betsy's door on several occasions, demanding to see her. Richard was seen as a very respected student at the university and was working towards his PhD in geology. Although respected for his talents in the field, many people described his behavior as, quote, erratic and bizarre. He was described as being socially awkward, especially around girls, and was known to have an explosive temper that could come off at the drop of a hat. He had also been suspected in several thefts from the school, but nothing could ever be proven. Now, it's unclear how Betsy and Richard met each other, but it was known that their friendship only lasted about a week before Betsy told him to leave her alone and that she no longer wanted to be friends. Her roommate further elaborated it was because Richard was wanting to be in a relationship with Betsy, but she wanted to remain loyal to her boyfriend David. Richard had a bizarre track record with women, and although he was awkward, he also had no reservations about chasing after and pining over various different girls across campus. At one point, driving from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts to the home of a girl he had met just 2 days before to tell her he was in love and wanted to get married. When she rightfully slammed the door in his face, he erupted in anger. Here's where it gets interesting. So although he chased after multiple girls and tried to maintain as many casual friendships as he could with various women, he never actually dated any of them. The main reason for this would come out many years later, in that Richard was in fact gay and was known to take extreme measures to conceal his homosexuality as much as possible, including appearing to be a, quote, ladies' man. Now, even though he had no sexual attraction to the women he chased, being rejected by them still sent him into a blind rage. Investigators officially interviewed Richard in December of 1969, and he openly admitted to being friendly with Betsy and even referred to her as his girlfriend on several occasions. Richard stated that he was eating dinner at the food hall on campus when he first heard rumors spreading about, quote, a girl murdered in the library. He stated that once he found out that it was Betsy, he became physically sick and ran back to his dorm room to lie down. He further stated that he had never even used the Patty Library before and was unaware of Betsy's schedule that day. With nothing else to hold him on, Richard was thanked for his cooperation, and investigators moved on, and for several years, that would be the end of Richard's involvement in the investigation into Betsy's case as it grew cold. That is, until 1975, when in August, Richard Haefner would be arrested on molestation charges after two teenage boys who worked in a shop Richard's parents owned came forward and stated that Richard had molested them on several occasions. Richard denied these allegations, but was still arrested and put on trial, which ended in a hung jury after neither boy wanted to testify and Richard was free to go. But even though Richard was free, his name being thrust back into the spotlight caused someone from his past to place a phone call to investigators a piece of information relating to the Betsy Aardsma case. A professor at Penn State named Dr. Lauren Wright called investigators to report a concerning incident that had occurred years prior. Dr. Wright was a geology professor at the college and was actually over the entire department. Richard was one of his students. He described him as being very intuitive and passionate about his work. So Lauren was calling investigators because on the night of Betsy's murder, November 28, 1969, he was at home with his wife having dinner when there was a sudden knock at the door just after 6 p.m. Answering it, Lauren found Richard Haefner standing there, out of breath, almost like he had ran the whole way there. Richard asked Lauren if anything had been reported yet in the news about, quote, his dead girlfriend that was just murdered in the library. Not sure at all what he was talking about, Lauren tried to pry more information out of him, but Richard kept their conversation vague before running off again and disappearing into the night. Lauren found the encounter odd, but decided not to go to police with the information as he didn't want to ruin Richard's career over a hunch. And it wasn't until years later he realized that Richard had told him about Betsy's murder long before it was ever announced to the public.
Poor Betsy, again, just bad luck. Some guy comes and obviously says something about a murder before it happens, and he's like, I don't really want to ruin this poor guy's career.
And that's the thing. This happened at 6 p.m. Betsy wasn't pronounced dead until 5:50, and her body wasn't found until about 5. So literally no one knew Betsy had been murdered except the mortician. So it's like, causes pause. And poor Betsy, it's about to get even more sad for her. So Lauren actually did state, however, that he went to the dean of Penn State at the time, the very next day after his encounter with Richard, and voiced his concerns about what Richard had said, but the dean told him to drop it and ignore it as he didn't want the school to be embroiled in a scandal. So, again, poor Betsy, because now it's like the school, of course, is like, we don't want to be involved, especially if the story is one of our students is a murderer. So they're like, just drop it. You have no actual proof, so just act like he never said it. So these new pieces of tidbits of information caused investigators to take a second look at Richard Haefner and discovered several interesting pieces of info. The first was that Richard was known for dressing sharp and fancy and was always seen wearing khakis and a sports jacket, like the unknown man seen in the stacks. On top of that, his physical description matched the composite sketch of the strange man almost perfectly. Sadly, too much time had passed since the actual murder that none of the witnesses could physically ID him in person. Like, looks like the guy, I can't say for 100% certain that it was. But by the time police were made aware of Richard's possible involvement, it was mostly too late. No physical evidence existed, and Richard refused to talk to police, and sadly, that was as close as they would ever come to catching him. Over the following decades, Richard's life was plagued by mental illness, arrests, and scandals. His molestation charges, although dropped, stayed on his record until 1981, and he struggled to find work after graduating with his PhD. He moved back in for a time with his mother in California before opening up his own mineral and rock shop, which I didn't know that was a thing, well, at least back then. In fighting the molestation charges, he sued countless people, including the 2 teenage boys, the judge over the case, and even his own lawyer. He grew increasingly paranoid and stated that the government was out to get him. His anger increased as he was known to lash out and attempt to attack his neighbors. Richard would live until the age of 58, when in March of 2002, while out on a hike, he suffered a tear in his aorta and bled to death internally, the exact same way as Betsy had died. One reporter remarked, "They died the same way, only the cause was different. Betsy by knife and Richard by God." So whether you believe that maybe that's some divine justice, I don't know, but it is eerie that he technically died the same way, like his aorta was torn and he bled to death internally. Richard was cremated, and his story seemed to end there. That is, until 2009, when Richard's nephew came forward with new information. The nephew stated that he was a preteen boy back in 1975 when he was spending the night over at Richard's mother's house. That night, he was awoken by Richard arriving at the house and his mother beginning to scold him in the kitchen over the molestation charges. Her scolding soon turned to concern as she asked him, quote, "Do you think they are onto you about the girl you killed?" She continued to scold him for how much she had protected him over the years and ended it by saying, quote, "You killed that girl, and now you are trying to kill me." Betsy Aardsma was buried on December 3rd, 1969, and she was laid to rest in her family's plot back in her hometown of Holland. A single rose was placed in her hands by her boyfriend, David Wright, who later told police he wasn't actually sure if he was going to come or not because he didn't want to miss school. That's where I was like, I kind of got pause on David's commitment. Betsy wrote him a letter a day for over a year. And he's like, I honestly don't know if I'm going to come to her funeral. I don't want to miss a day of school. Betsy's family has stated that they have long forgiven the man that took their daughter away from them and even asked the state to spare her killer the death penalty if he was ever caught. Over the years, Betsy's story has become something of an urban legend on Penn State campus as people still remember the girl murdered in the library. Reports of ghostly apparitions and hauntings have led many to believe that Betsy still haunts the library. Of course, you know how those stories go. Although her family believes she is firmly up in heaven, she actually came to them in a dream weeks after her murder and told them that she was happy and at peace and was waiting for them there. Betsy's case remains technically unsolved to this day, and although doubtful, it is still possible that one day it might be solved. That is the terrifying case of Betsy Aardsma, the girl murdered in the Penn State Library.
It's terrifying for a lot of reasons. One, it seemed very random, and she was in a pretty safe place. And then she got really crappy medical care. I mean, yeah, I understand there were circumstances to it and everything, but still it seems...
This whole case is frustrating. It was a series of unfortunate events is no other way to describe this
the
case.
police don't, put out the...
professor, the dean.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a series of unfortunate events all the way around for poor Betsy.
And it's interesting to think if everything had gone right, this case more than likely could have been easily solved. And one day I really hope it is solved because it still just seems so random. And again, if it was Richard, which kind of seems like it was, how did he know Betsy's schedule? How did he know she was back on campus?
He was just down there having sex with somebody and she just happened to be somebody that knew him and walked in on it.
Or was that another unfortunate event in that she just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time and caught them? So it's one of those things that will leave you thinking, just because, like I said, it's so terrifying to think that the killer obviously had either panicked and did it in a hurry, wasn't thinking, or was that enraged that the fact that they were like, I'm going to murder her in a public library with multiple other witnesses literally right around literally through the books. You could probably see them through the books on the shelf.
I mean, if it was two strangers, they could just pull their pants up and run off. And what is she going to say? But if she knew one of the guys,
it does, again, thinking with the 1960s mentality, if she knew you and caught you doing something gay, she could potentially ruin your life if she wanted to turn you in, which from what people described to Betsy, it sounds like she would not do that. She'd have been like, sorry, I didn't see anything, and been on her way. But also, people panic. People do a lot of weird and crazy things when they panic. So hopefully one day this case is solved because I'm itching to have a resolution to it. And I know her family is wanting one too. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast, and of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from this case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next Monday, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.